Alright everybody, coming to you live from Mr. Angelo's house. It is day 3 of virtual learning. I don't know if anybody's going a little bit crazy, staying at home all the time. Anyone feeling like this? Hopefully it won't last too much longer. We're doing the best we can with what's going on right now. I'm going to try and keep this one quick. The plan today is to review some of the assignments I've given you over the past couple of days, and then to explain how your Unit 5 test is going to work. So the first thing I want to do is go over this little chart that had some information about political reforms from the Progressive era. If you weren't able to access it, I attached an additional copy of it. It looks like this one. I'm just going to show you what fills in the blanks here, and then go over the questions that were at the bottom of this page. So what you should have filled in the first blank was the 16th Amendment. It goes in order. I'm not trying to insult your intelligence. It should be very simple right there. And that's the one that says the government can collect an income tax. The 17th Amendment was something I went over with you. That was also passed in the same year, 1913. And that's the one that says senators have to be directly elected by us, the voters, not chosen by the state legislature. The 18th Amendment was missing here. That was ratified in 1919. That's the one that prohibits or outlaws making, selling, and transporting alcohol. The time period when alcohol is against the law is known as prohibition because alcohol is prohibited. The last few things here, the initiative, the referendum, and the recall was the one that was missing. These are all things that are being done to give voters more control over their state and local governments. The initiative is the one that says we can suggest new laws ourselves. The referendum gives us the right to vote, to approve or reject a new idea for a law. And the recall is the one that allows us to remove somebody from office through a special vote, even if it's before that person's term has ended. So below that were these questions. I'm going to go through and I'll answer them with you. First one says, which reform gave voters the power to approve or reject new ideas for laws? Well, that one was the referendum. 2, what did the 17th Amendment say? Well, if we look back, or you have the paper in front of you, you're going to see that's the one that says we can vote for senators ourselves, directly elect them. 3, which reform makes it possible to remove elected officials from office before their terms have ended? That is the recall. 4, which amendment made it legal for the federal government to collect income tax? That is the 16th Amendment. And 5, what power does the initiative give to citizens? It gives us the power to suggest new ideas for laws ourselves. Okay? So your answers would be the referendum, senators are directly elected, the recall, 16th Amendment, and citizens have the right to suggest new laws themselves with the initiative. Okay, quick review on that one. I went over all the different topics that come from the standards that you should know about from the Progressive era in the first video I made, so I won't go over through all this again. But as we review the assignment I gave you for yesterday, or day 2 of virtual learning, these things will come up again. So I just want to go through, I'm going to go through all of the questions that I assigned that were in that textbook search. If you had trouble with that, I'm going to help you with it now. Even if you didn't get it done, if you complete it after watching this, I'll still give you credit for it. Okay, I want to make sure that everyone still gets credit for it, and I do my best to review things with you, even though we're not in the classroom together. I'm going to talk about the study guide. I'm actually going to make it part of your test grade. Since we can't test in person, I'm going to do like I've done in the past for your Unit 2 test. I'm going to make that study guide worth half of your test grade, and then I'll make the test itself worth half of the grade, and you'll do both online, and I'll explain that. Okay, the text search that was assigned for virtual learning day 2 looked like this one, and it told you specific pages to read to find answers to these different questions, but I'm going to walk you through all these. Okay, the first questions were asking about some pictures on page 517. They were pictures taken by a guy named Lewis Hine, photographs like this one that came from the book. So it said, what do you find unusual? Why do you think these images were helpful in the fight against child labor? Well, you could have said something about how young the kids are, how this kid has no shoes on, how they're working with the dangerous machinery. Anything like that we would not expect to see this in factories in America today. Often factories wanted kids because they were small, because their hands could reach into small places, and because they knew they could pay them less than an adult person. So these photographs by Lewis Hine show these young laborers. Sometimes they're 3, 4 years old, the kids in these factories. And he sneaks in to take these pictures because the people who own these factories don't want the public knowing about it. But once people do see them and see how these kids are being exploited and see how dangerous this is, it does convince the public to demand child labor regulations. The second question was a fill in the blank here, and I'll go through those with you. It said in the year 1908, famous Supreme Court case Muller versus Oregon, the court upheld an Oregon law that limited women to a 10-hour workday. So I think I mentioned on the first day I did a video that there was a push to get hours limited for women. The perception was that it would be dangerous for their health. They do succeed in 1908. Other states followed that example. And almost a decade later, in the subsequent case, Bunting versus Oregon, the court says men can't be forced to work longer than 10 hours either. Or if they do, they have to get overtime pay. It adds, progressives also succeeded in winning workers' compensation. So if you were hurt or killed on the job, your family would be paid for that. Up to this point, there was no compensation. If you got hurt, tough luck. If you got killed, so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Jones. Let's bring in the next worker. Progressives were the ones who fought to make sure we had these safeguards. They're the people that ensure we have the things in place today that protect our rights, like workman's comp. Okay, the third one, how did the 17th Amendment help give Americans more of a voice in government? Well, this was in the chart we started with. Because we can now vote for those senators, they're more accountable to us. They're going to listen to us. Senators that used to be picked by state lawmakers, it gave more power to kind of the political machine party bosses and the wealthy heads of corporations. Now, since the voters can directly elect the senator, they feel like, okay, those senators are going to be more responsive to me, more accountable to me. All right, before I ask you to give 2 examples of national women's organizations that are committed to social activism and to describe their progressive missions. One was the National Association of Colored Women, or NACW, and this was an organization made up of African American women that were focused on moral education. So they went to nurseries, reading rooms, kindergartens. Their thinking was, if we can get to kids when they're young, by the time they grow up, we will have set them up to be good citizens, to be good people. I think plenty of people still have the same attitude, and it makes plenty of sense to me. A second group that was mentioned in the book is the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. I've talked about that. People like Susan B. Anthony served as president of the NAWSA, and they were lobbying or fighting for women to get the right to vote. They tried to convince the state lawmakers. They filed lawsuits. They did everything they could to try to change this law or to ensure that women would be guaranteed voting rights, and they really pushed for a constitutional amendment that would do that. Okay, question 5, I asked you to read the excerpt, a little quote from Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. So Upton Sinclair is one example of a muckraker, somebody who wrote and exposed some of the nasty things that were going on in society. His book, The Jungle, was a novel. It was a fictional book about an immigrant family that came and lived in Chicago. But he did lots of research in these factories where they produced meat, they packaged meat. And much of what he learned, he included in his book. So there were plenty of things that were actually true that became part of his story. I'm going to read you this quote. If you didn't read it, it might turn your stomach a little bit. He says, "There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and thousands of rats would race about on it. A man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung, that's the poop of rats. The packers would put poisoned bread out for them. Then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers, the mixers together. Now what comes out of there? Breakfast sausage. whatever canned meat products that company sold. Now imagine reading this. You're sitting at the breakfast table, eating your sausage, and now you've read that there might be poison bread, poop, and dead rats in what you're eating. So that was plenty to turn people's stomachs. It reveals how sickening, how unclean and unsanitary the conditions are in these places. People all the way up to the president, and we'll talk about who's president at that time, a guy called Theodore Roosevelt, start to question, is this stuff true? If it is true, what can be done to put an end to it? So that was the big impact of the jungle. Part B, I asked, how did the public and the president and Congress respond? Well, people demand investigations. And the president puts pressure on Congress to pass some laws. Once they investigate and find out much of this stuff was true, they pass a law called the Meat Inspection Act in 1906, the same year the book came out. And this says factories, you have to be clean, things have to be sanitary. We're going to send in people from the government to inspect what's going on there. And that kind of thing is still done because it's done to protect us. We want to make sure the food we eat is safe and clean. Something else that happens that year is called the Pure Food and Drug Act. And this requires that foods have to be properly labeled with the ingredients that are in them, that medicines have to be properly labeled, and that they have to be honest about what those products do. For years and years, just like the picture here, they would sell elixirs, potions, things that would claim to cure cancer, grow your hair back, all kinds of wonder drugs. You should know that's not true. If you were looking at me, you'd know it's not true, otherwise my head wouldn't look the way it does. There is no magic pill that will grow your hair. There is no special potion that cures cancer. So the Pure Food and Drug Act says you can't sell things that are contaminated, spoiled, and you can't be dishonest about what's inside them. Progressives believe if you give people good information, if you empower them with information, they will make good decisions. That's an optimistic view of what people are like. The next question I asked about Theodore Roosevelt and how did he create the modern presidency. Roosevelt was really the first celebrity president in our history. He became president when William McKinley was assassinated in 1901. So he wasn't elected at that time. He assumed the role. And when he became president, he was only 42. So he's the youngest guy to ever take over as president. The youngest person ever elected was John F. Kennedy. He was 43 when he was elected, but Roosevelt is the youngest person to ever become president. He is a rough and tumble guy. He's somebody who is a horseback rider. He's into boxing. He's a big hunter. He has a very big personality, and he knows how to use that. He uses his popularity to further his agenda. People really like him, and that's part of how he thinks the president should be able to operate. I can use my popularity to get done what I want to get done. That's why they say he's kind of responsible for the first modern presidency. Famous face he has. Part B of that question says, how did he think the president and the national government, or what role should the national government fulfill? So he thought the president should be the steward or protector of the people. And he thought the government should do things to protect the public, should take over if states are incapable of dealing with problems. So again, because he was enormously popular, he felt like he could use his popularity. He called it a bully pulpit. He could shape and influence events by getting out, by being in the news, by constantly getting attention. It's interesting if you think about right now, whether you like him or not, one of the things that President Trump is very good at is manipulating the news or getting his message to come across, using his own popularity with certain people to further his agenda. Theodore Roosevelt was one of the first to do that. He said he wanted all Americans to have a square deal, basically a fair shot. And if you didn't know, he is one of the faces on Mount Rushmore there. I'll quiz you real quick. You have 4 people. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4. Go go ahead and guess at your screen. This right here, President number 1, George Washington. This guy over here, President number 3, Thomas Jefferson. And I hope you knew this guy, President number 16, Abraham Lincoln. Theodore Roosevelt was President number 26. Don't confuse him with Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt is a distant cousin of Theodore and comes later. Franklin is the one that's president during the Great Depression and World War II. Theodore was president during the early 1900s. Okay. Question 7, I said, look at the political cartoon. How did Roosevelt earn his reputation as a trust buster? So Roosevelt is a progressive era president, and this cartoon is showing him taming these lions, and these lions are supposed to represent the giant powerful companies of the Gilded Age, or the early 1900s. Roosevelt is going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act, the law that was passed that said it was illegal for a company to have a monopoly. It was very difficult to enforce, but he's going to do that to stop people from being unfair in their business practices. One of the first victories he has is over this Northern Securities train monopoly, and then he gets this reputation for being a trust buster, being somebody who's going to break up these monopolies to help the public. Now, he doesn't go after every monopoly. He thinks if it's a bad thing for the country, it should be broken up. If it's not bad, he's not going to attack it. But because he had this very kind of recognizable face and big personality, he was the subject of many political cartoons. So here he is going after the railroad trust. It says jujitsu on that one, or knocking out all these other giant corporations, wrestling with the railroad trust here, and as a hunter taking out bad trusts and letting other trusts live. If you've ever heard of a teddy bear, that's a nickname for that doll, stuffed animal bear, that comes from Theodore Roosevelt. He was a famous hunter, and there was a moment when he was on a hunt, and there was a tiny bear cub and mother, and he spared the mother. He didn't shoot it. So he got this reputation as being somewhat compassionate, and then so toy companies seized the opportunity and then saw that it was a good idea for marketing and nicknamed those tiny stuffed bears teddy bears, and the name stuck. Alright, this one here is connected to the next question, which I asked, results of the exploitation of natural resources. If you can't tell, these are pictures of a river that has caught fire. There was a river in Ohio called the Cuyahoga River. Between 1868 and 1952, the river caught fire 13 times. Now, if you're scratching your head and wondering how could a river, its water, catch fire, you might be able to guess it's because of how polluted it was. And that's because cities at that time just dumped their sewage, dumped their waste, their chemicals, whatever garbage there was, straight into the rivers. So many rivers are totally contaminated. And remember, that water at some point is going to be recirculated and can cause horrible health problems in addition to catching fire. Other things that are happening. Forests are being totally cleared. Ranchers are allowing their cattle to overgraze on lands. Coal companies are destroying the land when they blast for coal mines or in coal mines. And lumber companies are ignoring the fact that cutting down all these trees is leading to more floods. They're not planting trees to replace the ones they've cut down. So the environment is really being totally decimated during this era of industrialization because there were no rules to really stop people from doing this. So Roosevelt is one of the first presidents who steps up to do things to protect the environment. And he's a believer in what's called conservation. There's a picture here of a famous environmentalist named John Muir, and they're visiting a place in Yosemite, California. There are all across the country these beautiful national parks and forests that are preserved. You're not allowed to go in there and cut trees down. You're not allowed to go there and hunt or do anything to damage the environment, so it's going to be protected. That started with Theodore Roosevelt. So as a hunter and an outdoorsman, he believed the environment should be protected. Conservation means some natural resources will be saved, will be protected, Some wilderness areas will never be developed, and then other things he did believe could be developed for the common good. But during his time as president, he made sure 148 million acres of forest were preserved. He set aside 1.5 million acres of water power sites and another 80 million acres of land for experts from the Geological Survey for them to explore for minerals and water resources. They also set up wildlife sanctuaries, areas where animals would never be touched or never be hunted, and many national parks. Some of that money from the federal government will be set aside for irrigation projects, building dams, and things like that. Okay, Nana asked, why did W.E.B. Du Bois criticize Booker T. Washington? Well, I talked to you a little bit about Du Bois, a very famous African-American leader from this time period during the Progressive Era. And he criticized other famous black leaders. Booker T. Washington was somebody who was the head of the Tuskegee Normal Industrial Institute, an all-black training school. And he believed equality could be achieved by improving economic skills. He was somebody that said, if you look at this quote, the world cares very little about what a man or a woman knows. It is what a man or a woman is able to do that counts. So he focused on giving people job skills, training. And he didn't really think that African Americans needed to bring an immediate end to segregation. He said, in all things social, we can be as separate as the fingers on the hand, but in things economic, united as one fist, something like that. So he was okay with the idea that segregation would continue. He thought if we achieve economic independence, eventually segregation will come to an end on its own. W.E.B. Du Bois says, no, we cannot tolerate segregation. We can't allow that to continue for 1 second. It has to end immediately. And Du Bois also pushed for more opportunities at the highest levels of education for African Americans. He believed there was going to be this elite group of African American intellectuals, what he called the talented 10th, that would lead the way for the rest of African American society. What he demands is complete social, political, and economic equality. And remember, he is one of the founding members of the NAACP. A couple of quotes from him I like a lot. One says, children learn more from what you are than what you teach. If you hear your parents ever say stuff like, do what I say, do as I say, not as I do, read them that quote. Let them know, if you want me to act a certain way, you need to model that. Or all people should live by those words. And then the idea that things couldn't be delayed. He says, now is the accepted time, not tomorrow, not some more convenient season. It is today that our best work can be done. So, what is the NAACP? What were this organization's goals? Well, it stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It began in 1909, and it's still in existence. It had 6,000 members by 1914, and they say, we will accept nothing less than full equality. What they want is for all people to have the rights that are supposed to be guaranteed in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They want to put an end to these segregation laws, these Jim Crow laws. And they want people that are guilty of lynching, these horrific murders that go unpunished, to be punished. They push for a federal anti-lynching law. They're filing lawsuits constantly to try and challenge these things. Okay. We've talked about John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and these big business owners who were able to monopolize things during the Gilded Age. This cartoon is a critique of Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, showing it as this giant octopus that is all-powerful. Remember, one of the ways that Rockefeller was able to monopolize things, to get rid of his competition, was by using trusts, by having people join together essentially, put all of their stock in kind of a joint trust or a way of merging companies together so you wouldn't have to go against each other. 11 asks, what are two key antitrust measures that were passed when President Wilson was in office? So remember, antitrust means things being done to stop monopolies. I haven't talked about Woodrow Wilson yet. He's elected president in 1912. He will be elected for 2 terms. He's going to be the last major progressive era president, and he's also the president that will see the United States through World War I. He is supportive of these progressive reforms. The Clayton Antitrust Act makes the Sherman Antitrust Act stronger. It says you cannot take over the stock of another company if it's going to allow you to have a monopoly. It says if you violate the law, you can be prosecuted. It also gives labor unions and farm organizations the right to exist and protects them from being attacked by antitrust laws. It also legalizes strikes and peaceful forms of protest. The Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914, the same year, sets up the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission. It's a watchdog agency that gives the power to investigate trade violations. So if they think something improper is going on these big business owners, if they're doing something that's improper or illegal, they can investigate those things. They are going to report or get reports every so often from corporations, and they're trying to put an end to these unfair business practices. These guys who lie, cheat, and steal to do whatever they can to amass their fortunes. Okay, 12 says, how are women finally able to win passage of the 19th Amendment and gain the right to vote? Well, I think I mentioned this in the first video I made. Organizations had been fighting for the right to vote, going all the way back to the Seneca Falls Convention, the first big meeting for women's rights in 1848. But groups like the National American Woman Suffrage Association, those efforts, combined with all the things women did during World War I, the sacrifices they made, finally convinced the government that women deserved to be granted the right to vote nationwide. That's when the 19th Amendment is passed. It was finally ratified in 1920, 72 years after the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. Okay. Now, before we go patting Woodrow Wilson on the back too much for being this progressive era president, we should know that he is horrible when it comes to civil rights. He is certainly a racist man who is not supportive of equality. It's the kind of thing that's not talked about often with Wilson. When we study historical figures, people often like to put them in one of 2 categories, hero or villain. Usually, it's more complicated than that. There were plenty of positive things to admire about Woodrow Wilson, but his record on race relations is not one of them. So here's what's going to fill in the blanks that you have. Wilson convinced many African Americans to vote for him. He won the support of the NAACP, promising to give Black Americans equal treatment and to speak out against lynching. But as president, he gave in to what conservative Southern Democrats wanted. He picked people who believed in segregation, segregationists. They were in charge of certain federal agencies, and some areas that had been desegregated were once again segregated when he took over. Parts of the federal government, the military, even in Washington, D.C. When they pushed for anti-lynching laws, he opposed them. So he was not a friend to the African American community, and his legacy on race is definitely a blemish on his reputation. All right, how does World War I put an end to the progressive era? Well, remember, the whole time period is about pushing to reform, to improve society, to get rid of corruption, to put an end to ruthless business practices, to protect people against these abuses. Well, World War I, like other wars, is a big distraction. And when the country focuses its attention on the war effort, these reform efforts that people have been pushing for kind of stall. So World War I is going to dominate most of Wilson's second term as president, and that's why the progressive era comes to an end roughly around that time period. Sometimes you'll see them say it lasts from about 1890 to 1914. Other times it'll say 1890 to 1920, but that's roughly how long that time period ends. Okay? All right. Let me talk to you quickly about the study guide. You're going to see it's similar. I'm going to show you a picture in a second. 2 study guides we've done in the past. It's going to have a page number that refers to a page in your notes I've given you in the past, or a chapter and a section in that red book which you have access to online. That's where you're going to find the answers. The Unit 5 test I'm going to post It'll be multiple choice and one short answer, but I'm going to make the study guide worth 50 points and the test worth 50 points, just like I did for Unit 2. So hopefully it'll help more people be successful, and it also gives me a chance to evaluate you on what you're writing, not just on multiple choice questions that you can easily look up from the comfort of your own home. I'm going to go over this specifically here, and you're going to see this attached. It says this study guide will count for 50% of your Unit 5 test grade. Make sure to answer all questions accurately and completely. Like I just told you, answers can be found in your Unit 5 notes or classwork, or chapters 13 to 17 of the Red Americans textbook. That link you'll be able to click on it in the document has the online version of the book. Just like I pointed out, right here at the end of each question is either a page number from your notes or classwork, or a chapter and a section where the information can be found in the book. Now, listen carefully to this part. Do not copy and paste answers from outside sources. Your work must be your own, or you will not receive credit for it. I know it's very easy to Google anything, to just copy and paste an answer, or even to copy and paste from the book, but I'm not giving you credit for that. This is part of your test grade, and really your classwork, you shouldn't be doing that either. It doesn't really show me that you've learned anything. I know this is crappy. I know this is strange to be working this way from home. Believe me, I'm going a little bit crazy myself doing it. Let's do the best we can. Hopefully it will be over sooner rather than later, but if it's not, we're going to have to get used to doing things this way for a while. Please, please, if you need help, as always, send me a message on Verge. People are doing that. Send me an email. I'm happy to get back to you. I'm really going to be available from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon when typical school hours are running. Okay? I hope you're doing all right. Stay healthy. Stay safe. Talk to you soon.